The autumn wind carried whispers of doubt through the streets of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the fall of 1921. Margaret Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching two children play in the backyard of her modest brick home on Maple Street. They laughed, they ran, they looked exactly like the twins she had given birth to 3 years ago. But deep in her chest, where a mother's instinct dwells, something screamed that these children were strangers. It started 6 months after the fire at St. Catherine's Hospital. The blaze had torn through the maternity ward on a February night in 1918, sending nurses scrambling with newborns wrapped in blankets, their cries piercing through the smoke and chaos. Margaret remembered waking to the smell of burning wood, her twins only 3 days old, still nameless because she and her husband Thomas had been waiting for the right moment. When the nurses finally returned Emma and James to her arms, something felt different. The weight, the way they cried. But she was exhausted, traumatized by the fire, and the doctors assured her that stress was clouding her judgment. Now, 3 years later, the feeling had grown into a certainty that poisoned every moment of her life. Emma, who should have had Margaret's green eyes, stared back at her with dark brown irises. James, who had been born with a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder, showed no such mark when she bathed him. She had mentioned it once to Thomas, her husband, who worked long hours at the Jones and Laughlin steel mill, but he dismissed her concerns with a tired wave of his hand. Babies change, he said. Eyes darken, birthmarks fade. She was being hysterical. But Margaret knew what she knew. She had carried these children for 9 months, felt every kick, every movement. She had memorized their faces in those first 3 days, traced their features with trembling fingers, counted their toes, kissed their perfect foreheads. These children in her home were not hers. The neighborhood of Lawrenceville bustled with activity that October afternoon. Coal smoke hung in the air, mixing with the metallic scent from the nearby steel mills. Women hung laundry on lines strung between tenement buildings, while men gathered on corners, discussing work and politics. The streets were packed with immigrants from Poland, Italy, and Ireland, all seeking their piece of the American dream in this industrial city that never slept. Margaret had lived here her entire life, born to Irish parents who had crossed the ocean with nothing but hope and determination. She knew these streets, knew the rhythm of this place, but lately everything felt foreign, including her own home. Emma came running into the kitchen, her dark curls bouncing, asking for a glass of water in that high-pitched voice that should have sounded familiar, but somehow didn't. Margaret poured the water with shaking hands, studying the child's face for any trace of herself or Thomas. The girl had a wider nose, fuller lips, a different-shaped chin. Thomas said she was imagining things, that grief from losing her mother earlier that year had made her see problems where none existed. But this wasn't grief. This was knowledge. At night, Margaret lay awake beside her snoring husband, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city through their thin walls. Factory whistles, distant trains, neighbors arguing in languages she didn't understand. She thought about the fire, about the confusion, about how many babies had been in that ward. At least 15, maybe 20. In the chaos of evacuation, with smoke filling the halls and nurses grabbing any child they could reach, how could they be certain every baby went back to the right mother? She had started keeping a journal, documenting every difference she noticed. The way James held his spoon, how Emma giggled high and sharp, nothing like the soft cooing Margaret remembered, the texture of their hair, their sleeping patterns. Page after page filled with observations that Thomas refused to read, evidence he called the product of a disturbed mind. But Margaret wasn't disturbed. She was a mother who knew, with every fiber of her being, that someone had taken her children and left these impostors in their place. The question that haunted her wasn't whether the switch had happened. She knew it had. The question was what to do about it. Who would believe her? The hospital had closed its maternity ward after the fire, its records damaged or destroyed. The head nurse who had been on duty that night had moved to Philadelphia. And Margaret was just another working-class mother in a city full of them, with no money for lawyers and no connections to people who mattered. She was alone with her certainty, drowning in a truth no one else could see. November brought freezing rain to Pittsburgh, turning the cobblestone streets into rivers of black slush. Margaret walked through the downtown district. her worn coat pulled tight against the cold, making her way to the Carnegie Library on Forbes Avenue. She had a plan now, born from weeks of sleepless nights and desperate thinking. If the hospital records were destroyed, she would find another way to prove what she knew in her soul. The library's grand entrance loomed before her, its limestone facade darkened by years of industrial soot. Inside, the warmth enveloped her like an embrace. She approached the reference desk, where a young librarian with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from her work. Margaret asked for newspapers from February 1918, specifically editions covering the hospital fire. The librarian led her to a back room, where bound volumes of the Pittsburgh Post sat on wooden shelves, each one heavy with the weight of recorded history. Margaret spent hours poring over the brittle pages, her fingers tracing headlines about the fire. The reports described the chaos, listed the names of nurses who had acted heroically, mentioned in passing that all 23 babies in the ward had been successfully evacuated. 23 babies, 23 sets of parents. In the accompanying photograph, she could see nurses holding blankets, smoke billowing from windows, mothers crying on the street. She studied every face, searching for something, anything that might help her case. But the newspapers offered no answers, only confirmation that her fears were justified. In such chaos, mistakes were inevitable. She copied names into her notebook, the same leather-bound journal where she recorded her observations about Emma and James. Nurse Patricia Doyle, Nurse Ruth Hanson, Dr. Michael Brennan. These were the people who had been there that night, who might remember something, who might be willing to tell the truth if confronted with the right questions. Finding them proved harder than she expected. The hospital administration refused to provide forwarding addresses, citing privacy concerns. Margaret persisted, spending her afternoons when the children were with Thomas's sister, asking neighbors, checking city directories, following leads that often went nowhere. Pittsburgh was a big city, over 500,000 people, and 3 years was a long time for trails to grow cold. Factory smoke continued to belch into the gray sky, streetcars clanged along their routes, and life moved forward while Margaret remained trapped in that February night. She finally located Nurse Ruth Hanson through a classified advertisement in the Pittsburgh Press. Hanson was working as a private nurse for a wealthy family in Shadyside, a neighborhood of mansions and manicured lawns, far removed from Lawrenceville's gritty streets. Margaret took 3 streetcars to reach the address, rehearsing her questions during the long ride. When she knocked on the servants' entrance, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and graying hair answered. Ruth Hanson remembered the fire. How could she forget? It had been the worst night of her career, she said, standing in the doorway, reluctant to let Margaret inside. But when Margaret pressed her about the babies, about whether they might have been mixed up in the evacuation, Hanson's expression hardened. Every baby went back to its mother, she insisted. They had been careful. There were no mistakes. Margaret showed her the journal, the list of differences she had documented, but Hanson shook her head. Babies change, she said, echoing Thomas's words. Mothers sometimes imagine things, especially after trauma. She suggested Margaret see a doctor, perhaps someone who specialized in nervous conditions. The door closed, and Margaret stood alone on the stone steps, rain beginning to fall again. She felt the weight of futility pressing down on her shoulders. Everyone thought she was crazy. Her husband, the nurses, probably the neighbors, though they were too polite to say it to her face. But she wasn't crazy. She was right. Walking back to the streetcar stop, Margaret noticed a woman pushing a pram through Mellon Park. The woman had dark hair and wore an expensive coat, clearly one of the wealthy residents of this neighborhood. She was cooing at the baby, adjusting its blanket with tender care. Margaret felt a stab of envy so sharp it took her breath away. That woman got to love her own child. That woman didn't have to pretend every day, didn't have to force affection for children who felt like strangers. By the time Margaret returned to Lawrenceville, evening had fallen. The street lamps cast yellow pools of light on the wet pavement. She could hear the steel mills in the distance, their constant rumble a reminder of the city's relentless industry. Thomas would be home soon, expecting dinner, expecting her to have spent the day caring for their children like a normal mother. She couldn't tell him where she had really been. He had made it clear that her search for the truth was an obsession he wouldn't tolerate. Inside their small home, Emma and James sat at the table where Thomas's sister had left them with colouring books. They looked up when Margaret entered, their faces innocent and expectant. She felt nothing. No surge of maternal love, no instinctive connection, just emptiness, and the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there her real children were being raised by someone else. Winter descended on Pittsburgh with brutal force, bringing temperatures that froze the Allegheny River and turned the city into a landscape of ice and smoke. Margaret's investigation had stalled. Every lead ended in rejection. Every conversation reinforced the same message, that she was a troubled woman who couldn't accept reality. But on a bitter morning in January 1922, everything changed. The news came in a shouted headline from a paperboy on the corner of Butler Street. 2 children found dead in Homewood. Margaret bought the paper with trembling hands, her breath creating clouds in the frigid air. She stood on the sidewalk reading, oblivious to the people pushing past her, to the cold seeping through her thin boots. The bodies of twin children, approximately 3 years old, had been discovered in an abandoned warehouse. Police were investigating. No identification yet. No parents had come forward. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Twins, 3 years old, the same age as hers, the same age as the children taken from her. She cut out the article with kitchen scissors when she got home, added it to her journal, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen to write the date. This could be them. This could be her real Emma and James. The next morning she left the house before dawn, telling Thomas she was going to help a neighbour who had taken ill. He barely looked up from his coffee, too exhausted from the night shift to question her. The streetcar to Homewood took 45 minutes, rattling through neighbourhoods that grew increasingly run down. Homewood had once been a thriving community, but economic hardship had turned many of its buildings into shells, their windows broken, their doorways sheltering people who had nowhere else to go. Margaret found the warehouse easily enough. Police barriers still marked the scene, though no officers remained on guard. The building was a massive brick structure, its roof partially collapsed, its walls covered in peeling advertisements for products no one made anymore. She approached slowly, her stomach churning with dread and desperate hope. If these were her children, she needed to see them. She needed to know. A detective emerged from a side entrance, a stout man in his 50s wearing a heavy overcoat and a fedora pulled low against the wind. Margaret intercepted him, her words tumbling out in a rush. She had twins, she said. They might have been switched at the hospital. She needed to see the bodies. The detective, whose badge identified him as Detective Frank Morrison, studied her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He had heard stories like this before, grieving parents desperate for answers, seeing their lost children in every tragedy. But something in Margaret's eyes must have convinced him, because he sighed and told her to wait. He returned 15 minutes later with another officer and led Margaret inside the warehouse. The smell hit her first, rot and decay, and something else she couldn't identify. They descended a staircase to the basement, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. In a corner, covered with sheets, 2 small forms lay on makeshift tables. Morrison warned her it wouldn't be pleasant. The children had been dead for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. The cold had preserved them somewhat, but it was still a difficult sight. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Morrison pulled back the first sheet. A little girl, dark curls matted, her face peaceful in death. Margaret's knees buckled. She knew that face, not from 3 years of living in her house, but from 3 days in a hospital room. This was her Emma, her real Emma. The shape of her nose, the curve of her small chin. Even in death she could see the resemblance to herself, to her own mother, to the family line that ran through her blood. The second sheet revealed a boy with Thomas's strong brow, with the birthmark on his left shoulder that Margaret had searched for and never found on the child living in her home. James, her James. Dead in this cold warehouse, his small body covered in marks that suggested neglect and worse. Margaret's scream tore through the basement, raw and primal, the sound of a mother's grief finally validated and unleashed. Detective Morrison caught her as she collapsed, helped her to a crate where she could sit. He brought her water, waited while she sobbed, then began asking questions in a gentle but persistent voice. Why did she think these were her children? What evidence did she have? Margaret told him everything, her words punctuated by gasps and tears. The fire, the switch, the differences she had noticed, the journal she kept. Morrison listened, taking notes, his expression growing more serious with each detail. He asked if she would be willing to bring her husband to identify the bodies officially. She nodded, though she knew Thomas would resist. He had refused to believe her for so long, had dismissed her concerns as madness. But now there was proof, terrible, heartbreaking proof that she had been right all along. Her children had been taken. These imposters in her home were someone else's twins, and somewhere out there was a woman who didn't know her real children were dead, who was raising Emma and James in ignorance of the truth. Thomas arrived at the police station that evening, his face pale beneath the grime from the steel mill. Detective Morrison had sent an officer to fetch him, telling him only that his wife had made a serious claim that required his immediate attention. Thomas looked at Margaret with confusion and anger, still believing this was another manifestation of her delusions. But when Morrison led them both to the morgue, when those sheets were pulled back again, Thomas's world shattered. He stood frozen, staring at the small bodies, his work-roughened hands clenched at his sides. Margaret watched her husband's face transform, seeing the moment recognition hit him, the boy's birthmark. The girl's features, so clearly a blend of his and Margaret's characteristics. These were his children, the children he had held in the hospital for 3 days before the fire, the children who had been taken from them and replaced with strangers. Thomas turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with tears and something else, something that looked like shame. She had been right. All this time, she had been telling the truth, and he had dismissed her, had called her hysterical, had refused to even consider the possibility. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The damage between them was too deep for a simple gesture to repair. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, had left her alone with her certainty while everyone called her mad. Detective Morrison gave them time, then brought them to his office, where he laid out what the police had discovered. The children had died from exposure and malnutrition, abandoned in that warehouse by persons unknown. Based on the state of decomposition, they had been dead for approximately 2 to 3 weeks. There were signs of long-term neglect, suggesting their care had been inadequate for some time before their deaths. Morrison needed to know everything about the hospital fire, about the night the babies had been returned to their parents. Margaret retrieved her journal from her handbag, the pages worn from constant handling. She showed Morrison her meticulous documentation, dates and observations that painted a picture of a mother who had known, who had fought to be heard, who had been ignored. Thomas sat silently, his head in his hands, while Margaret recounted every suspicion, every dismissed concern, every moment she had tried to make someone listen. Morrison assigned 2 officers to the case, beginning with a thorough investigation of what had happened the night of the fire. They would interview every nurse, every doctor, every parent who had been in that maternity ward. They would find out who had taken the real Emma and James Whitmore, and who had left different children in their place. The question of where the other children, the ones currently living in Margaret's home, had come from was equally urgent. Somewhere, another set of parents needed to know their children were alive. The news spread through Lawrenceville like wildfire. Neighbors who had whispered about Margaret's strange behavior now looked at her with horror and sympathy. The woman who had seemed unstable was actually a victim of an unthinkable crime. Thomas's sister, who had been caring for Emma and James, brought them to the police station, confusion etched on her face. The children, sensing something was wrong, clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. Margaret looked at them and felt only emptiness. These were not her babies, they had never been her babies. For 3 years she had tried to force herself to love them, had gone through the motions of motherhood while dying inside. Now, sitting in Detective Morrison's office, she understood the full scope of the tragedy. Her real children had suffered. They had been neglected, abandoned, left to die in a freezing warehouse. While she had been feeding and clothing and caring for someone else's twins, her own Emma and James had been crying out for a mother who never came. The guilt was overwhelming. She had known something was wrong. She had known from the beginning. But what could she have done differently? Who would have believed her without proof? The system had failed her. The hospital had failed her. Her own husband had failed her, and now her children were dead, their small bodies lying in the city morgue, while strangers slept in their beds. Thomas finally spoke, his voice hoarse. He asked Morrison what would happen to the other children, the ones who had been living as Emma and James Whitmore. Morrison explained that they would need to find the biological parents, which might take time given the hospital's destroyed records. In the meantime, the children would be placed with social services. Margaret and Thomas couldn't keep them, not now, not knowing what they knew. It would be impossible for everyone involved. The children were led away by a social worker, their small hands still clutching each other. Margaret watched them go and felt nothing but relief. She didn't want to see them again, didn't want to be reminded of the 3 years she had spent in a living nightmare, mothering children who weren't hers while her own suffered and died. The door closed behind them, and Margaret turned to her husband. They needed to plan a funeral. They needed to bury their real children and try to find a way to live with what had happened. The investigation was just beginning, but for Margaret, the worst was confirmed. She had been right all along, and the price of that truth was more than any mother should have to bear. The investigation into the St. Catherine's Hospital fire intensified as Detective Morrison and his team combed through every record and interviewed every surviving nurse and doctor connected to the maternity ward. Margaret and Thomas were asked to provide all the details they could remember about the night of the fire. Every sensation, every conversation, every glance that stood out in their memories. The police discovered that the hospital's records had been partially destroyed in the blaze, but some documents had survived, including a list of all the babies who had been in the ward that night. Morrison learned that on the night of the fire, 23 babies had been in the maternity ward. Most had been evacuated successfully, but 3 were unaccounted for in the initial reports. 1 baby had died in the fire, but the other 2 were never found. The hospital had assumed they had perished, but there was no definitive proof. Margaret's story suddenly gained credibility, not only because of the bodies found in Homewood, but because of these missing children. The police tracked down the parents of the other twins in the ward, asking if they had noticed any differences in their children after the fire. Most dismissed the idea, but one couple, the O'Connells, admitted that their daughter, Bridget, had always seemed different. Her eyes were lighter than either parent's, and her temperament was unlike anything in their family. They had attributed it to the trauma of the fire, but now, with the police's questions, doubt began to creep in. Margaret met the O'Connells at the police station, her heart pounding as she looked at their daughter. Bridget was a healthy girl with light brown hair and green eyes that reminded Margaret of her own. The O'Connells were hesitant, but when Margaret showed them her journal and described the details of her own twins, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The O'Connells agreed to DNA testing, though the technology was still in its infancy, and the process would take weeks. During this time, Margaret and Thomas were forced to face the reality of their situation. The children living in their home, whom they had raised for 3 years, were not theirs. The O'Connells' daughter Bridget might be Margaret's real child. The police were still searching for the 3rd missing baby, but hope was fading with each passing day. Margaret struggled with guilt. She had raised these children, fed them, clothed them, loved them as best she could, even though she had known deep down they weren't hers. Now, she was faced with the possibility of losing them, of giving them up to their real parents just as she had lost her own. The thought of saying goodbye to the children who had been her family for 3 years was unbearable. Thomas, meanwhile, was consumed by anger. He blamed the hospital, the nurses, the system that had failed them. He wanted justice, but he also wanted his family back. He didn't know how to reconcile the fact that the children he had raised might not be his, and that his real children were gone forever. The police continued their investigation, interviewing every nurse who had worked that night. Most had moved on, some had retired, but a few still lived in Pittsburgh. One nurse, Patricia Doyle, was found living in a small apartment in the Strip district. She remembered the fire vividly, but claimed that every baby had been returned to the right mother. When confronted with the evidence of the missing children, she became defensive, insisting that mistakes were impossible. Morrison pressed her, showing her the hospital records and the list of missing babies. Doyle finally broke down, admitting that in the chaos of the fire, some babies might have been mixed up. She didn't know which ones, and she didn't know what had happened to them. All she could say was that the situation had been impossible, with smoke filling the halls, nurses running in every direction, and babies screaming in the darkness. The investigation was far from over, but Margaret finally felt a sense of vindication. She had been right all along. Her children had been switched, and now the truth was coming to light. The police were determined to find the third missing baby, and Margaret and Thomas were determined to find their real daughter, Bridget, if she was indeed theirs. The DNA results arrived on a cold February morning, bringing with them a mixture of relief and sorrow. Bridget O'Connell was indeed Margaret's biological daughter. The test confirmed what Margaret had always known in her heart. The O'Connells were devastated, having raised Bridget as their own for 3 years, but they understood the situation and agreed to let Margaret take her home. Margaret and Thomas brought Bridget to their home on Maple Street, the house that had once been filled with the laughter of twins who were not theirs. Bridget was shy at first, clinging to her parents as she adjusted to her new surroundings. Margaret watched her with a mixture of joy and guilt, knowing that she was taking a child from another family, even as she welcomed her own daughter back. The O'Connells visited often, wanting to stay involved in Bridget's life. Margaret welcomed them, understanding the pain of losing a child, even if that child was not biologically theirs. The two families formed a bond, united by the tragedy that had brought them together. Meanwhile, the police continued their search for the third missing baby. The investigation had uncovered evidence of a nurse who had left the hospital shortly after the fire, moving to a small town in Ohio. Morrison and his team traveled to Ohio, tracking down the nurse whose name was Ruth Hanson. She had been working as a private nurse for a wealthy family, just as Margaret had discovered months earlier. Hanson denied any involvement in the switch, but the police found evidence that she had been seen with a baby shortly after the fire. The baby's description matched that of the third missing child. The police questioned Hanson, showing her the hospital records and the evidence of the missing babies. Hanson finally broke down, admitting that she had taken the baby, believing she was doing the right thing. The baby, a boy named Michael, had been raised by Hanson's sister in Ohio. The police located Michael and brought him back to Pittsburgh, where he was reunited with his biological parents. The parents were overjoyed, having believed their son had died in the fire. The reunion was emotional, with tears and embraces as the family was finally complete. Margaret and Thomas watched the reunion with a mixture of happiness and sorrow. They were happy for the families who had found their children, but they were also reminded of their own loss. Their real children, Emma and James, were gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back. The police investigation concluded with the arrest of Ruth Hanson, who was charged with kidnapping and child endangerment. The hospital was also held accountable, with new protocols put in place to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Margaret and Thomas were recognized as heroes, their persistence and courage bringing justice to the families affected by the fire. Bridget settled into her new life, adjusting to her new family and surroundings. Margaret and Thomas did their best to make her feel at home, but the pain of losing Emma and James was always present. They visited their graves often, remembering the children they had lost and the children they had found. The months that followed were a blur of grief and adjustment for Margaret and Thomas. Bridget grew more comfortable in her new home, but the loss of Emma and James was a wound that never fully healed. Margaret often found herself staring at the empty spaces in the house, the places where her twins had once played, their laughter echoing in her memory. Thomas struggled with guilt and anger, blaming himself for not believing Margaret sooner. He had dismissed her concerns, had called her hysterical, and now he was left with the knowledge that he could have prevented their children's suffering. He threw himself into his work at the steel mill, trying to distract himself from the pain, but the guilt was always there, a constant companion. Margaret, meanwhile, found solace in her journal. She wrote about her children, about the days they had spent together, about the moments she had missed. She wrote about Bridget, about the joy of having her daughter back, but also about the sorrow of knowing that Bridget was not the child she had lost. The journal became a place where she could process her grief, where she could remember and mourn and heal. The O'Connells continued to visit, wanting to stay involved in Bridget's life. Margaret welcomed them, understanding the pain of losing a child, even if that child was not biologically theirs. The two families formed a bond, united by the tragedy that had brought them together. They celebrated holidays together, shared meals, and supported each other through the difficult times. The community of Lawrenceville rallied around Margaret and Thomas, offering support and comfort. Neighbors who had once whispered about Margaret's strange behavior now looked at her with sympathy and respect. They had seen the strength it had taken for her to fight for the truth, to persevere in the face of disbelief and rejection. Margaret began to speak out about her experience, sharing her story with other parents who had lost children. She became an advocate for better hospital protocols, for the importance of believing parents when they say something is wrong. Her story inspired others to speak up, to trust their instincts, to fight for the truth. The police investigation had brought justice to the families affected by the fire, but Margaret knew that justice could not bring back her children. She had to find a way to live with the loss, to honor the memory of Emma and James, to make sure their story was never forgotten. Bridget grew more comfortable in her new home, adjusting to her new family and surroundings. Margaret and Thomas did their best to make her feel at home, but the pain of losing Emma and James was always present. They visited their graves often, remembering the children they had lost and the children they had found. The years passed, and Margaret and Thomas found a way to move forward. Bridget grew into a bright, confident young woman, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Margaret and Thomas did their best to give her a happy childhood, to fill the house with love and laughter. But the memory of Emma and James was always there, a silent presence in their lives. Margaret continued to speak out about her experience, sharing her story with other parents who had lost children. She became an advocate for better hospital protocols, for the importance of believing parents when they say something is wrong. Her story inspired others to speak up, to trust their instincts, to fight for the truth. The community of Lawrenceville continued to support Margaret and Thomas, offering comfort and encouragement. Neighbors who had once whispered about Margaret's strange behavior now looked at her with sympathy and respect. They had seen the strength it had taken for her to fight for the truth, to persevere in the face of disbelief and rejection. The police investigation had brought justice to the families affected by the fire, but Margaret knew that justice could not bring back her children. She had to find a way to live with the loss, to honor the memory of Emma and James, to make sure their story was never forgotten. Bridget grew more comfortable in her new home, adjusting to her new family and surroundings. Margaret and Thomas did their best to make her feel at home, but the pain of losing Emma and James was always present. They visited their graves often, remembering the children they had lost and the children they had found. Margaret and Thomas found a way to honor Emma and James, creating a scholarship in their names for children who had lost parents. They wanted to make sure that their children's memory lived on, that their story would inspire others to fight for the truth, to never give up, to always believe in the power of a mother's love. The story of Margaret Whitmore became a legend in Pittsburgh, a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Margaret's courage and determination brought justice to the families affected by the fire, and her story inspired others to speak up, to trust their instincts, to fight for the truth. Margaret and Thomas found a way to move forward, to honor the memory of their lost children, to make sure their story was never forgotten. They continued to fight for justice, to support other families who had lost children, to make sure that no parent would ever have to go through what they had gone through. The legacy of Emma and James lived on, a reminder of the power of a mother's love, of the strength of the human spirit, of the importance of never giving up, of always believing in the truth. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.